Nobody would have imagined a year ago that Arthur Haig, the mildly interesting proto-modernist author, sometimes dismissed as a poor man's D.H. Lawrence, would suddenly provoke a genuine academic flutter. To blame for over a dozen recent journal articles and conference papers is Haig's newly exhumed and bewildering novel, Swan Haven. The 1907 book is unlikely to catch fire among general readers, but it has rattled gatekeepers of cultural memory on either side of the Atlantic, including a well-known emeritus of the Literary Review, who called it, quote, a conscious defilement. Ultimately, Haig's crime is to have infected his reader with an unwanted question about the ethics of storytelling. It is a question so fundamental that fiction ordinarily never dreams to trouble us with it. This will be my only warning, that there are full spoilers ahead for Swan Haven. One can't help but wonder how the novel must have unfolded to Edward Garnett, the great literary cultivator and critic, among whose documentary remains the manuscript was found in 2016. It's unclear if Garnett had met the author, although he had admired 2 of his short stories in the English Review. The editor would not have flinched at jarring naturalistic fiction, but I can only imagine his alarm at each turn of those later pages. Alarm not at what they approach, but at what they leave behind. I can see Garnett with his feet up in an erect tapestry armchair, submitting patiently to an exasperated letter from Conrad on his struggle to render the violent anguish of a secret agent's wife. He puts that aside and settles into Haig's offering. Set in his grandparents' generation, it is the story of Lydia, an educated woman of 23, heading quietly into a marriageless future amid a Shropshire family in decline. Her siblings having vanished into Birmingham, London, and America, she lives alone with her remote father, a provincial magistrate, and the recent advent of a stepmother. The new parent is pleasant and detached. Although languid in character, she makes occasional insinuating advances toward Lydia, but never arm in arm with the father. The newcomer alters the ambient light in the house and within her young housemate. The expansive vista Lydia had once dimly perceived within herself now seems like a flat, hanging arras, and behind it she discovers, to her own surprise, a brick-solid hatred of her father. At night, the murmurs and sighs seeping into Lydia's bedroom fill her with pain and rage. Twice she finds herself standing on the dark threshold of the master bedroom, fingers tight on the open door handle. In their unconscious embrace, her father and his new wife, quote, cannot, will not see her. Enclosed in the insensible countryside, Lydia feels herself becoming a sharp-clawed creature, quote, burrowing aimless in dark earth. Her days are spent in books and dutiful work, but never in response to pressing need or desire. After the night's coaxing dreams, each morning is a shock of remembering the meaningless toil ahead. Lydia walks in the road one cloudy afternoon. She is blank, carrying her overcoat against her belly, and feels only the wheel ruts, the sight of them, pulling her along. Ahead comes her father's trap. She doesn't bother to look up until the horse comes to a stop. "What are you doing out here?" he scowls. An ambiguous drizzle begins to fall. "Put on your coat, dear," the woman beside him says. Lydia climbs into the back of the carriage, making space for herself among the sacks and packages they've brought from Shrewsbury. "Do put on your coat, dear. Where are you going?" As the horse moves on, Lydia fumbles with her bundled garment and draws a hatchet from its folds. At the end of a long swing, her father crumples under the blunt end of the metal. The tool jolts from her fingers and clatters in the trap, the handle falling into her stepmother's lap. "Sorry," Lydia says, reaching over to retrieve it. Then she lifts and brings the blade back down clumsily into the woman's neck, then the shoulder, then again the neck. Minutes later, the carriage trundles on. The awkwardly folded bodies pitch in the rig like sacks of grain. Holding reins slick with blood, it occurs to Lydia without alarm that she had not foreseen the event of passing somebody on the road. She had considered few eventualities. But she sees nobody before turning the gelding into a level meadow that eventually dips from sight and merges somewhere beyond, with a woodland rising back into view. The trap objects to the uneven grassland, and twice she nearly submits to the relief of simply walking the 6 miles back home. But she finds that a loose plank in the carriage can bend to her will and be wrenched free. There's nothing for it then but to wedge the wood under the entrenched wheel. Over and over she moves back to front, urging forward the chagrined animal and its burden. At the bottom of the meadow, Lydia can haul the trap only a little way into the wood, but far enough to find the deep hollow she had buried into the earth weeks before. Clearing away its covering of branches and soil-heavy leaves, she fears finding some animal trapped below. But there is only a pool of water from which her own face gazes back at her, curious. The trek back to the road is not difficult with the empty rig, even as a real rain begins. Under her coat, she rides 1/2 mile towards Shrewsbury before dismounting again. With a loud bark and slap on the gelding's flank, she sends the carriage clattering on, then leaves the darkening road, this time to the north. In the crevice of a crumbling hedge wall, she shrinks against sheets of rain. Eventually, Lydia closes behind her the only front door she has ever known. Standing in the hall is the one remaining household servant her father has retained. The cloudy woman's eyes seem in pain when forced to raise themselves to the horizon. But she watches Lydia with an attention she has never before given any member of the family. Both women see the scene, Lydia soaked raw in the lantern light, and all the night's questions fall away. The servant understands the consequence of all things, descries all possible futures for herself. Without a word, her mistress climbs the stairs. So ends Chapter 3 of Swan Haven. In the ensuing weeks, Lydia is surprised by a sense of purpose in acting the role she now must play. A turning point comes when she speaks sharply to a Shrewsbury High Constable. Where are her parents? Why is so little being done to find them? Why, when their blood-stained carriage had been found just a mile from town? Of course it was blood, nobody could tell her otherwise. The downpour had not washed everything away. Why were the county police not consulted as well? She sees the officer's flinch, his shuffling, his grim bark at a subordinate, sees them as discrete objects that she has manufactured into the world. The mystery hanging over Shrewsbury does not dissipate as months pass, but its ominous sheen wanes into pastel. Upon a full year of legal persistence, Lydia manages to shed her father's majority stake in 3 struggling flax mills, one of which is visible in the winter from her bedroom window. In the course of business, her eye falls anew, as it so often does now, on the small dormitory she now owns near the mill. She finally sets to work relocating its handful of remaining laborers. She sees behind these Browning windows a new free school for girls. In little time, Lydia has the structure all but gutted and repanelled. She wants a wide, expectant emptiness in the schoolroom. Despite conscientious preparation and heavy canvassing, however, Lydia finds herself standing before only 6 students at the beginning of her term. Yet from the first moment, morale is firm and confident at Tannerside School for Girls. In the presence of this mistress, each student comes to perceive the fundamental equilibrium of the world, the illusion of its disharmony. Rarely do the voices of mill workers angling through the windows have the power to trouble their clear morning eyes. Something in Lydia's level brow made the girl certain that if she could just extend her aura beyond the school, then the world outside would pause in sudden recognition of its own bumbling and striving. One student, Ida, is sharp and serious in a way that makes Lydia attentive. Ida watches the teacher as if she had no mother of her own to absorb her watching. Even after leaving the schoolroom in the afternoon, Ida seems to linger and await her own return the next morning. As the season darkens onward and the open space becomes chill and aloof, the girls bend absorbed over their work. Lydia is daring enough to weave Horace and Hacklet among lessons in household management and what the era calls, with some ambiguity, accomplishments. Ida becomes Lydia's right hand, a confidant so well understood that few words are heard to pass between them. This intimacy seems only natural to the other girls, just a prominence in their little unique landscape. By the end of the third term, nobody looks askance at Ida's having come early to gather wood for the mistress, to scrub the entryway floor, to prepare the needlework. Ida rinses the inkpots one afternoon as Lydia gazes at her strong back. The teacher understands suddenly that the girl has decided never to marry. But there is no murky vision of spinsterhood before Ida. This is equally clear. She is stepping precisely into a figure of elevated self-containment that for a year has been poised before her. In the following season, the classroom swells by 7 new arrivals. Among them is Holly, the bright, dreamy daughter of an estate manager employed by Lydia's father when her mother was still alive. Between Holly and Ida erupts an intense and silent rivalry. It reaches a crisis that ultimately gives birth to friendship. Over time, Holly is awed by Ida's sincere and virtuous heart, and gladly takes the role of aide-de-camp's aide. She too falls willingly into the mistress's lonely inner orbit, knowing there is no conscious exertion behind Lydia's gravitational power. The elder rests at the center, but asks for nothing. 2 summers come and go. For the young women, this close triad is a refuge from home, and each lets an alienation in that other place take its course. For Ida, home is a mother utterly withdrawn from the world, racked with inexplicable melancholy. For Holly, it is a restless brother and self-regarding father locked in battle. Wraiths at home, the girls materialize only around their teacher, in her kitchen on a Sunday, fetching supplies from town in Lydia's old carriage, walking along the escarpment-edged lake that the villagers call Swan Haven, or beside her fire in the winter. A suitor enters the scene. The women collectively exhale. George Ben, an old schoolmate of Holly's brother, is a solicitor's clerk who has made himself agreeable to landowners and merchants in Shrewsbury with his inexpensive services as a conveyancer. Holly is cautious of his attentions, but welcomes as exotic his relaxed, watery good nature. Ida, despite having assumed her pretty friend would eventually marry, stiffens with resentment. She cannot conceive how Holly's feelings could reach beyond the magic circle. But she says nothing. Upon meeting George for the first time, Ida is nearly paralyzed, but for an unexpected reason. This was the man who had, in Haig's words, insulted Ida many months previously at a charter fair. The author's use of the term insulted is somewhat anachronistic, and can imply a range of sexual transgression. But given the period and his own past work, Haig would not have feared calling a rape by its name. In any case, Ida sees at once that George does not recognize her at all. Yet Ida cannot bring herself to speak of it to Holly or even to Lydia. Holly sees herself pulling away from her friend and her mentor. She will marry George, this she knows. But she is certain, too, that it will be a betrayal, and she will now have to understand herself in light of this fact. The couple becomes engaged, and Holly spends more time at home to receive the young man with her family. But even at the moment she finally accepts his proposal, George can see Holly's spirit is in decline. Even within her desire for him, something in her has crumbled. George is put off by sadness. It seems to call for some posture or gait unknown to his limbs. As the weeks pass, he absents himself more frequently in his work, allowing his formal understanding with Holly to take the reins of courtship. One day, after Ida and Lydia have spent the morning laughing at themselves trying to master a borrowed canoe, they're surprised on shore by Holly. The girl clasps both of her teacher's hands and covers her own face with them to weep. She pours out all of her shame and confusion, lays everything at Lydia's feet. In that moment, Ida is sure that Lydia will tell Holly to go nowhere her heart has not impatiently preceded her. Ida knows that the words, whatever they be, will be decisive. And still she cannot speak of George, nor even of the loss she is feeling of a sister. Lydia puts an arm around Holly's shoulders, and with the other takes Ida's hand. They walk toward the road without speaking. Lydia then tells Holly that she must hold to the promise made to her future husband. As if a spell has been broken, or replaced, Holly becomes calm and abstracted. In the busy weeks leading to the wedding, an urgency flares up among them. The transformation of the maiden alters Lydia's elevation over both young women, dissolving whatever is unearned or illusory there. Yet Holly's consciousness at the altar belongs as much to Lydia's unseen eyes among the pews as to the man gazing complacently into her own. Ida, meanwhile, sits quietly throughout, trembling. Holly disappears into matrimony. Letters take her place. Ida seizes each of these, only to wonder by the second page what hunger such lines could possibly satisfy. On a cold April Sunday, Lydia and Ida gaze through the windows of her sitting room, drinking fresh whey from a neighboring farm. They sit mostly without speaking, with a comfort in their silence that most friends only assume that they can achieve. Ida recalls to Lydia the letters she sometimes receives from her uncle, the steward of a Lincolnshire estate. For over a year he has coaxed her with the prospect of tutoring his employer's 3 girls in French and piano. She has declined on the grounds that the people of that country, by all reports, do not look kindly on those with ginger hair. But presently Ida tells Lydia that she has accepted the offer. Lydia looks deeply into the young woman's eyes, and then congratulates her student in a warm embrace. In an epilogue, we see the gentle unfurling of Lydia's life and the growth of her school. In the following years she hires 2 teachers of her own, and with George's help, finds backing to build a proper schoolhouse closer to the high road. Never again does she find deep friendship among her students or fellow teachers, although she secretly cherishes the somewhat awed respect of these companions, and offers her own in kind. That's the end of Swan Haven. Nothing in my reading experience prepared me for the sense of something crawling in my skin, there really is no better way to put it, as I watched the pages under my right hand dwindling in that long final chapter of Haig's novel. The feeling would disappear at intervals as I became reabsorbed in the anxieties of these characters, only to come creeping back. The realization that this novel was going to end without revisiting in any way the atrocity of the 3rd chapter. From that brutal murder emerges no repercussion of any kind. Even more disconcerting is the fact that once the Tannerside School is underway, the horrific event simply never intrudes in Lydia's thought or action. And despite my literary critic's mind, eager as it is to see anything but a cigar, I cannot find a single unconscious manifestation of the event in any subsequent word or deed in the novel. If Swan Haven were an unintelligent or weakly imagined fiction, this inconsequence would make it only ridiculous. But Edward Garnett himself would have been captivated by the minutely observed psychological interplay beneath the spare dialogue, and by Haig's clear-eyed vision of the sometimes violent ebb and flow of subterranean emotion. Most novelists since the 18th century, wagging fingers at Samuel Richardson, have insisted they must not be expected to depict virtue rewarded and vice punished, for that is not the way of the world. Yet Swan Haven seems to expose their weak commitment to this principle. In the history of fiction, there may have been controversy here and there about crimes of indecency left unpunished in Aphra Behn, or some roguery in Daniel Defoe whose only consequence is titillation. But cold-blooded murder is never just abandoned by the conscience of a novel. Haig's tale is not satire, not born of a freewheeling picaresque world. It emerges from the brooding earnestness of early 20th century realism. Does Swan Haven confront us with the fact that we would expect some kind of moral accountability even from a pitiless naturalism, whose unblinking gaze is supposed to face a universe without moral accountability? Realism of any stripe is not meant to be governed by an ethic, and its exposure of the rational and irrational alike is supposed to be justified entirely by the honesty of its endeavor. The summary I just gave of Swan Haven cannot reproduce the honesty and dexterity with which it steps carefully through the drama of one lonely consciousness confronting another. Yet it still leaves me queasy. I cannot dismiss the novel on the grounds that it presents a distorted, merely sensational view of the world. I'm stuck with the fact that nothing in Lydia's psychological trajectory is impossible or even implausible. On the approach to her crime, the novel dives as deeply into her soul as, say, Women in Love looks into Hermione's before her attempted murder of Rupert Birkin, and with no less mystery and insight than Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, as it anticipates Septimus Smith's suicide. It just so happens in Swan Haven that Lydia is able to banish the crime from her consciousness soon after the event, and so too does the novel. Is it possible that what would save Haig's novel is not moral accountability, but merely an accounting of the murder on any terms in the final pages of the book? If only the denouement had somehow evoked the terrible event, if it had suggested, say, that the dissolution of the women's friendship could somehow be traced to it, or even that the strength of their bond, forged by Lydia, had been due to the killing, then we might at least absolve the novel of crimes against coherence and meaning. Or, God help me, if only Lydia had murdered Ida when the young girl announced her departure, then our moral order would have been restored. But how odd is it that the mere closing of a circle would be enough to assure ourselves that we are in the presence of meaning? Contemporary fiction is unbearable in its use of such pointless circuits to establish an ultimate significance, to justify itself in the mechanical sense of the term. How often have we followed a disturbed character and his intriguingly disturbed activities, only to discover the meaning of it all in a revelation that he had suffered some singular trauma as a child? Or, alternately, we're given the trauma from the beginning, and only await the hero's hard-won mastery over it when it inevitably returns in another guise. how satisfied we are in this return, in the mere tracing of this circle. It often doesn't matter what sort of vector the author scribbles across the page. As soon as she puts a mirror beneath it, the mere symmetry justifies everything. I complain only about lazy structural maneuvers and explanations. I do not reject the search for meaningful connections within the apparent schizophrenia of Swan Haven. Of course, everything depends on that. I recently found some comfort, for instance, in a conference paper arguing that no matter how sympathetically the novel renders the relationship among its three principals, the Edwardian author intended that transgressive homosocial bond to embody the moral consequence of Lydia's, quote, unnatural crime. There is something compelling in this, although I would say that the novel can't be conscious of such motivation, if it exists. Haig is not a writer who cares to bury so deeply an intended effect. But if Swan Haven is unconsciously governed in this or any other way, is that enough to absolve it of the charge of incoherence, moral or otherwise? No matter what cultural significance my new historicist training can find in the novel, I'm not alone in butting my head against the question of its conscious design. What does Swan Haven think it's doing? If there are correlations or thematic patterns that make sense of the crime in relation to the whole, we would like the author to have crafted them deliberately. But then we're back at the beginning. How can we expect reality to unfold according to an author god's thematic plan? The south end of a quilt need not mirror the north. Ought we not accept a fabric spun of honest weaving? If we reject the perfectly plausible outcome of Swan Haven, is it not to avoid an inconvenience to meaning and morality? Precisely what realism is not supposed to do? Just beyond the 5th chapter of Charlotte Bronte's Villette, an unnamed family crisis chases Lucy Snow to the continent. If the significance and justification of the novel stems from the drama that emerges in that new foreign land, then the same must be true of the drama among Lydia and her friends. Yes, it seems inevitable that this argument seeks to reintegrate in some way a moral pariah. This coming from me in particular, of course I understand why most of my present viewers will grin knowingly. I notice yet another entry has appeared in the extended BuzzFeed profile of the professor with the disgraceful past. To be honest, these have been fairer than the brief piece in the national paper I won't name, at least as more facts have emerged to temper that first sensational posting. I make this argument about Lucy and Lydia, that perhaps their real story begins after the opening crisis, only in a fantasy that it might be read for what it is, escaping somehow the tyrannical eye of the reader god in his information age, and not solely for what may have compelled it.